So, the topic of tonight's talk is your awakened moments. And that might come as a surprise to some of you. You might think, what awakened moments? I haven't had any awakened moments. Or, I haven't even begun meditating. Well, the truth is, you don't need to have begun meditating. It helps a lot. But you know what? Awakened moments are always an option. And you may well have experienced some and maybe many. And we're going to be talking about this, just that, tonight. And I wanted to start out with a comment by Shunryu Suzuki. He was a Japanese Zen master in the 20th century. And he's made a comment. He said, I don't know so much if there are enlightened beings, but I know there are enlightened moments. Now, Suzuki was some of you may have read his book. He wrote a classic book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And he came to the States in the 50s from Japan and began the San Francisco Zen Center and was really very, very well respected. Japanese, and they called him Suzuki Roshi, where Roshi in the Japanese Zen world means master. So Suzuki Roshi said, and this wonderful comment, I don't know so much if they're enlightened beings, but I know there are enlightened moments. And I think that this is a really interesting statement, because first of all, I think there are enlightened beings, and he was one of them. But among other things, I don't think he would have even said he was one of them for a couple of reasons. And I'll just say one of those reasons is I'm sure that his students projected onto him many, many elevated ideals. And being Japanese, he probably would have wanted to just kind of play that down. He probably had quite enough. He didn't want to kind of foment more of them. But I think he was one of them. And I think he is right about the enlightened moments. We don't think very much about enlightenment, I think, these days, especially in our community here. I don't think this is a very big idea around here. I think most of us are concerned, like, oh, how do we get through just this moment? So much stress, which is one reason why, as Teresa announced earlier, mindfulness-based stress reduction. It works. It really works. You might want to consider a class if you haven't taken it before. I think we think that enlightenment doesn't have a whole lot of bearing on our daily life, whereas mindfulness can really help us get through it. And moreover, I think we don't even quite know what enlightenment is, like what in the world is enlightenment. There was, and some of you may know, if you've been around a little bit longer, that there used to be a magazine called What is Enlightenment? That was the title. It and its companion magazine called Enlightenment Next disappeared in about 2013, along with its founder, who was a charismatic being, and it was discovered that his behavior was anything but enlightened, and so both the magazine and he kind of disappeared from the scene. But what is enlightenment is the question. And here is what the blurb for the magazine said. And said that the term means a state of supreme bliss, wisdom, and grace that the Buddha and other spiritual masters supposedly achieved. So that's a quote from the website about what enlightenment is. I think if we were to ask ourselves, many of us kind of think that enlightenment is kind of connected somehow or another with nirvana. We've all heard that term, and the Buddha spoke about nirvana. And he described nirvana in a lot of different ways, or used different adjectives like it's the unborn, the uncreated, the unfabricated, the unconditioned, the undying. And that one of the expressions of enlightenment is liberation. Now, I got to say, I think most of us say, well, that doesn't clarify things too much, does it? This is it sounds pretty abstract. And then you say, liberation from what? And it is, and the Buddha pointed this out time and again, from our personal narrative, from our conventional views that life is simply that and nothing more. Maybe simply that, but it's more than that. And the Buddha was challenging that. And he said we can find that out for ourselves. One of the most powerful statements, I think, that the Buddha did make, he said, don't believe anything I say. Come and find it true for yourself. Now, like, wow, that's quite a statement. And this is one of these things that I think the Buddha was calling on us to find out. What am I really talking about? He's talked about a lot of things. And one of the things, ultimately, that he was pointing to was this state, and we can call it enlightenment. There's a story at a recent retreat for people who are training to be mindfulness teachers. In training for mindfulness teachers, there was a retreat in DC not too long ago. And one of the trainees, she's gone through a 2-year program, coming to the end of it, volunteered to be amongst a few that got up on the stage and had questions thrown at them. That is, questions about the teaching. And so she got the question, somebody asked her, well, do you know any enlightened beings? Without a blink, she said, yes, my dog. And just as some of you did, laughter. I mean, there were about 1,400 people there. I mean, a lot of people in this place. Laughter. And then she went on and she said, my dog was always present. My dog was alert and always loving. And she talked about that at some detail. And by the time she finished, and it was really short, but when she finished, people clapped. It was so beautiful. An enlightened being. And was her dog. The enlightened being, like her dog, is the natural state. The natural state for us as human beings. Not quite the same as for a dog, but still alert, present, loving. Same things, same things. The natural state. It's a state that is always present in not only the Buddha, but many spiritual teachers talk about it. It's never gone. It always is, it always was, always will be, and is present now. The natural state that's always available to you, to me, to each of us. And many people have talked about this image. It's like the sun, which shines all the time, but there are clouds that often, for us as individuals, seem to cloud over the sunshine. We don't see it. That's what it is. And the invitation that our practice is to more and more experience the sunshine, to more and more go through these clouds of thinking, and particularly difficult, unwholesome thoughts that seem to spiral in our mind, right? Find the sunshine, finding the sunshine. Now, I will say, we don't think much about the word enlightenment or the state of enlightenment these days. But when I started out in this practice so long ago, it was big. I started out in Zen, and enlightenment was a big deal. I mean, we heard about enlightenment and that we could attain it, and when you did, all your problems, like presto, were solved. You had no problems if you were enlightened. It's what Zen students, and I think a lot of other Western students in those days of these inner wisdom practices, really thought and learned. You get enlightened, and you've got no problems. They're solved. It's kind of like wall-to-wall bliss or equanimity or something wonderful. At least that's the idea that I had at the time. And I got to say that we've learned over the years that, wait a minute, it really, for those of us who have even glimpsed anything like that, it really doesn't quite work like that. It's not like every problem is going to be solved. There's a sea change. There's something remarkable that happens. But it's not like, you suddenly know and no longer have problems with your significant other, or that you suddenly know how to deal with your teenage daughter. You know how to do your taxes. None of those things are necessarily changed as a result of glimpsing what this is all about. I was talking not too long ago with another friend who had also started out way back then, and we were talking about this idea that we understood the teachers clearly to be saying that, and the texts we read clearly to be saying, get enlightened and that's it, you've got all your problems solved. And she was rather perturbed. She felt betrayed by these early teachings. Like, how come they told us that when it actually isn't the way it really is? There's a significant change, but not everything. And I have a different response. And my response is that I think that these teachings and the early teachers have matured. just as we do in our practice. And we mature and recognize that, yeah, other skills are needed as well if we are going to get through our daily life. They're not the only things. Enlightenment is an issue, but it's not the whole thing. There's more that we need to be learning. Now, I think amongst us here, not the term enlightenment, I think preferable to us than the term enlightenment is the term awakening. I think we much prefer to use that term, and I was thinking about this as I was writing this talk and working on it and thinking about it. And I think the reason is enlightenment sounds like it's a done deal. It's one thing, you got it, you always have it, and that's it. Whereas awakening is a process. Enlightening kind of like sounds like enlightenment is state, and awakening is a process. And that we, I believe, can understand ourselves as working at awakening bit by bit. We're kind of chipping away at it, perhaps, is how we might see it. Certainly the Buddha's teaching, as they appear in the scriptures, are for this graduated path, step by step. And then he makes this huge leap, and he talks about the end of the path as well. So he's got the whole thing, but you know what? We take the step-by-step overall approach, and starting right where we are and working at it. So here's a description from a 20th century Thai teacher. Her name was Ki Nanayan. She wrote a wonderful book called Pure and Simple. And she said, if you learn to see through things the moment they arise and keep having your own little instance of awakening, your awareness will keep getting brighter and brighter, stronger and more expansive. This is the progressive approach, the chipping away at it approach, the going step by step. It's like using an image that's not mine. If you had a black piece of paper and you put a pinhole in it, you have a little bit of light coming through that pinhole. This is the having your own little moments of awakening. You know, a little bit of light there, and another, a little bit of light there, and more and more and more. And suddenly there's light, more expansive, as she said, more expansive. This is the progressive approach. Like everything else in this world, there are two sides of the coin. Everything has a good and a bad, an up and a down. We know that, the relative world. It's not all one way, and including the progressive approach, the approach that we take here. The cost to the progressive approach, a cost, can be we're always seeking. We're always looking to improve, to have a better meditation, to clean up this kind of unwholesome pattern in this little place where we're stuck, to get deeper, to know more. It's the striving that the practice can trigger. Never enough. It's always got to be kind of more and better. Fixing ourselves. The idea of fixing ourselves. It can become like we're a rabbit with a carrot hanging in front of us, and we're always after that carrot and never can quite make it, because there's always more, of course, to improve. I mean, we're human beings. We're never going to be perfect. That's the bad news. And so we're always after it, right? Always after. So this is a cost to this progressive approach. It's always trying to fix ourselves and others, perhaps, as well. So it's really easy, almost natural, to assume I'm not good enough. You know, I've really got a long, long way to go. And this is reinforced by our general cultural idea that I think we so prevalent in our culture, like we're inadequate, right? We've talked about this many, many times here. Like, how many of us feel like we just, aren't really up to snuff. So these two things kind of work together, reinforcing each other. So what this comes down to is there's a paradox, a deep paradox in practice. And it's something that it's worth recognizing, the paradox. It's not easy to get the mind around it, but on the one hand, it is absolutely true that this starting right where we are and working progressively is important, and we need to do it. That's on the one hand. And the Buddha laid out how to do it. And we know the four noble truths. First, that there's suffering in life. Don't we know that? Secondly, that the cause of suffering is when we are just holding on to something, like an unwholesome approach. And the way to get rid of it, third, or deal with it, work with it, is we begin to let go. And the fourth, the Eightfold Path. He spoke about 8 factors that we can practice with, one of which is mindfulness, in order to alleviate suffering. So this is the progressive approach, and that's one side of our paradox. It's important. But on the other hand, if we stay right there and we're always chasing like a rabbit after a carrot, we're going to miss another really fundamental feature of the practice, and that is resting. Being right where we are in the moment with all its seeming imperfection and our own seeming imperfection, and simply accepting and knowing it without trying immediately to fix, change, improve. So we both need to, if we want to be peaceful and content, we need to start practicing and begin to create some discipline with our mind and our patterns. And at the same time, the other side of the paradox, we need to learn to be present, truly present, resting without trying to achieve, Which brings me to the idea of wise effort, which is one of the Buddha's factors in the Eightfold Path. We've talked about that many times here. We need to make wise effort. When the Buddha spoke about wise effort, he actually talked about kind of 4 major factors. He said, and he's talking about thinking, the thinking. He said, when unwholesome thoughts arise, try to prevent unwholesome thoughts from arising. In other words, if you have an unwholesome pattern, don't just use that as default and just sink into it. Try to prevent it. If you have sunk or find the mind has gotten involved in something that is wholesome, and the actions as well, because actions follow the mind, then he said, let go, abandon, leave it alone. That's the second aspect of wise effort. The third, develop wholesome ways of thinking and acting. And thinking comes first. It's really clear from the Buddha. From the Buddha's point of view, thinking comes first. All actions are led by the mind. That's what he said. The mind is the master, the mind is the maker. Act and speak with an unsound mind, and unhappiness will follow you as the cartwheel follows the foot of the axe. And then he said, act and speak with a wise and with a clear mind, and happiness will follow you as your shadow follows you without departing. The thinking first, your actions follow. So he said, develop wholesome patterns, intentionally develop. And we do that here, don't we? This is what we are talking about night after night. And then he said, continue with those. Continue with maintain the wholesome thinking. This is wise effort. And it is key. It is fundamental. And the fact is, there comes a place where too much efforting is not wise. Now, what a paradox. Wise effort, and then you don't want to do too much. Like, oh my, it calls on us to be adults and make a decision. When is this going to be too much? It's not like we just keep going and trying and trying and trying. You have to recognize at some point it's time to draw back, and just be present. So, the paradox. I'm sure you've all heard the statement, I never promised you a rose garden. Now, the Buddha didn't say that, but he could have. He could have, because he knew just how difficult this practice is. I'm not only talking about the half an hour a day you may spend or more in meditation. I mean living the life that this is drawing us to. That is hard. And there's no getting around it. It's joyful, and it's also extremely, extremely hard. Because on the one hand, as I said, we have to know what the wise effort is and all the other factors in the Eightfold Path and practice them. And on the other hand, recognizing what is this non-practice practice. The time when comes that we need to just be present. Non-practice practice. Both are called for. Both are called for. So that means balance. We need to learn to balance. And mind doesn't want to balance. I mean, these are two contradictory truths, right? Try and don't try. Strive and don't strive. What mind enjoys that kind of conflict? We don't like that. The mind wants one thing, it wants certainty, and it wants to run with it, right? Well, that's just not our practice, which is why it isn't a rose garden. It's not a rose garden. So we need to find balance and begin to learn to accept what is true in this moment and be able to rest in the unpleasant truths. We have all kinds of skillful ways of dealing with them. But first, before we jump in and start our skillful ways of dealing with getting rid of something that's unpleasant, be there. Experience it. That's what we're being called to do. Accepting and allowing. Accepting and allowing. So I'll just tell you a little bit about my story. And I'll say that I'm in the process, I've just sold my house, and I'm in the process, I'll be moving to a condo next month. And I can just tell you everything is pretty, well, upheaval is a good word for it. So equanimity is not my pervading mind state at the present moment. In fact, I've been thinking, I'm more like a deer in the headlights. Have you seen this emoji with the big eyes, and raised eyebrows and like this, it's like, oh God, what's going on here? That's kind of how I've been feeling lately. And yet, at the same time, there's the knowing. The knowing something of the sun, it's there. Even amidst all this stuff and chaos that's happening, both. It's not like just one or just the other. It's both. And we can balance them. I'm not saying I always do a great job at the balancing, but it's known. It's known. And it's possible. It's possible. So I thought I would tell you a story, maybe two if there's time, of acceptance. Many years ago, back in the 90s, I am a Reiki practitioner, energy healing. And there was a time during the 90s, the late 90s, when I volunteered at a house, a facility for AIDS patients. And everybody living in this quite large house was an AIDS patient, and they had a terminal diagnosis. Many stories from those days. But the one I want to tell you is about a man named Marvin Black. Marvin was a man who had very little education, formal education. He was an ex-offender. He had spent time in prison. He was a black man, and he was gay. I mean, talk about having lots of social strikes against him. I mean, he had them. And he had a terminal diagnosis. However, he was at a state still where he was physically more fit than many people in that house. And what Marvin was doing was he had begun writing poetry. Poetry that were actually in the forms of kind of prayers, not only poetry, but in the form of prayers. And he would go onto some of the buses in St. Louis, on the buses, and he would put them on little placards, taking them, and he would sell them because he didn't have much money. He would sell them. I bought a couple from him. So here is one that I want to read you. This is very simple, and it's got saran wrap covering it. And he said, it's called prayer. And he said, "Dear God, so far today, I've done all right. I haven't gossiped. I haven't lost my temper. I haven't been greedy, grumpy, selfish, or overindulgent. I'm thankful for that. But in a few minutes, God, I'm going to get out of bed. And, and from then on, I'm probably going to need a lot more help. Amen." So Marvin told me that he said, there is a way where he is actually glad that he had AIDS and was in this facility. He said, because he's come to find that he can do this poetry, which he had never any idea before. He was radiant. He was just radiant with it. And I thought of Marvin's example. In fact, I just had forgotten I had this. I'd had it stored away, and I've been going through everything. And this and another one of his turned up, and I was thought, wow, this is so beautiful. Fits right in with this idea of accepting and allowing what exists, what exists. So, other people accepting, allowing. And I think the bigger point of what was going on was right in the middle of all this difficulty and a death sentence, he was radiant and happy. And awakened moments, I think he had many. I think he was living with many awakened moments. He wouldn't have called it that. I mean, this is this thing from his mind. But you could just see this being who he was. So that brings me to this question in the topic about your awakened moments. Because I think we've all had them at some time. The moments when you have simply rested in what exists. A sheer acceptance of the moment without the mind going on and saying, yes, but, right? That's what the mind likes to do. Yes, but, it's a beautiful moment. Yes, but it's always got some kind of qualification. But there have been moments when we have just been present. And I want to cite one that Nancy Elizabeth Nimitz, who is not here tonight, but a few weeks ago here, she expressed one of those moments that was so touching, I thought. I was going to talk about it, and then I asked her if she could just give me she could tell me in her own words. I'm going to read them, but the situation was, she said that night that she was more stressed than she could ever remember herself being. She had a certain situation she was facing. And this was a moment that happened in her kitchen, and she was putting away some dishes. And here's what she wrote about it, because I asked her if she could explain it, say it to me, and here's what she wrote. She said, at that stress, and she was putting away a dish on a shelf, and she said, at that stress-filled movement, I became very aware of the size and shape of the dish located in my hand relative to the shelf on which I was going to place it. Aware of the colors, shapes, physical sensations of the movement of my hand and arm, etc. Then I was suddenly aware of how calm and peaceful all was, including myself. She rested. It's mindfulness, is it not? This is what we're always inviting ourselves to do. She rested in a moment of mindfulness, and it was stunning. She couldn't get over the shift from the sense of being utterly stressed to all of a sudden it was peaceful. It was an awakened moment. So what I would like to do is invite you right now to reflect about a moment when you have just dropped in to the present moment. Why not close your eyes for a moment and just reflect? It might be something so very simple. It doesn't have to be bells and whistles and trumpets and angels. Just a very simple time. Maybe you were walking in a forest, the woods, or weeding your garden, or drinking tea in a cafe. Just a moment when you were utterly at peace for that instant. If you're having a hard time finding one, no problem. It's okay. Just allowing yourself to sit comfortably and quietly without trying to search. If nothing comes up, no problem. Just be present. Just a moment when you are utterly present. And recalling to yourself what the quality of that presence was. What was the quality of that moment? Not just the circumstances. What was the quality, the felt sense of it? Can you invoke it? Even a bit, maybe. Thank you, friends. Now, what I'd like to do is to invite, if anybody can share a moment. Again, something it might be very, very simple.
It was just the other day hiking. And
put it right under your...
It was the other day I was hiking, and I had sat on a rock for a little while, and then I stood up and I looked up at the trees. It was kind of rainy and darkish, but just felt supported by the woods. It was kind of like my mind kind of brightened, I guess. So
beautiful.
That was the one I thought of.
Thank you, Kristen.
This is several years ago. This came to mind for some reason.
Put it right up to your lips.
Several years ago, I was getting some kind of scary medical treatment that all worked out fine, but at the time it was scary and gloomy and not fun. And I was in the room where there was all this equipment around me and some nurses and such. And I just kind of looked around, and all of a sudden my mind shifted over into, this is interesting. This is what getting X treatment is like. This is what this is like. And I suddenly just felt just sort of this sense of peacefulness, and the quality was curiosity.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. In a difficult situation, she was just present. What a shift. Thank you. Anyone else, please?
So the other night I had to take the red eye back from Seattle in order to make it back for a friend's wedding on Saturday. And so there I was, 10:30 West Coast time on the airplane, just thinking how awful it was that I was going to have to sit up all night in that uncomfortable seat, and what a bad night's sleep I'd get and all that. And then all of a sudden I realized, this is kind of like the second arrow, isn't it? I'm just building all this stuff up in my mind, making this experience a lot worse than it needs to be. And I just let go of all that and became present. And it was just fine. It wasn't so bad.
Thank you, Angel. And for those of you who don't know, Angel said it was like the second arrow. The second arrow, many of you know, comes from the Buddhist scriptures, and the Buddha told a kind of a story. He said that we suffer because suffering is a part of life. But what we usually do is we shoot ourselves with a second, he called it a dart or an arrow. We shoot ourselves with a second dart, and that's the thoughts about how awful it is, and it's bad, and it hurts, and this, blah, blah, blah. And that's just what Angel was doing, and then all of a sudden wait, here's the teaching. Just the teaching comes home. I'm second arrowing. Yeah, thank you. What a shift. Who else? One other person. Anybody else? That's Betty.
I was walking with a friend at Ivy Creek this morning, and I was so happy to get out in the sunshine after all the rain we've had. And so we got pretty far in along the Peninsula Trail, and all of a sudden all these really gray clouds came overhead, and it looked dark. And I have in my past a very traumatic thunderstorm event in my life, and I'm very sensitive to weather. And so all of a sudden I felt really afraid. I thought, oh no, here I am. We're far away, and it looks like we're going to have a storm. And so my friend said, should we keep going or go back? And I said, we're going back. So we started very hurriedly going back, and I could just feel how afraid I was after being so relaxed and such a beautiful walk. And then all of a sudden I heard, I'm a bird watcher, I heard a Swainson's thrush, which if anybody's ever heard that, it's the most magnificent sound that you can imagine. It's multiple notes that play over each other. And I just kind of everything dropped out of my mind. And I said to my friend, it's a Swainson's thrush. And we just like both just like, it was like everything was fine. So
Thank
that
you.
was my moment.
Thank you, Betty. So I think many of us can recognize within our own awakened moments, because I think many of you have had them, it's a matter of simply being present. The mind can make it a misery, or else it can allow it to be simply what's present in the moment. So I would like to invite you as a practice, I'd like to invite you to remember, call to mind during your day, repeatedly, an awakened moment that you've experienced in the past. The quality of it, not in order to hang on and to recreate the same thing, but to invoke the quality of awakeness in your life. Does that make sense? You see the difference? I'm not saying, oh, I had an awakened moment, let me go get back and get it again. It's not that. It's the quality of that moment that we are capable of invoking in our life. Doing this repeatedly, there's one teacher who has a wonderful statement. She says, short moments of awareness repeated often become automatic. Short moments of awareness repeated often become automatic. Why not do that as a practice, in addition to the mindfulness practice? Remember at the beginning at our meditation, I said, step into the background of your attention. You've heard me say that before, I know. The background of your attention, that's where this moment of awakeness comes in. During your day, do that. Just re-invoke the quality of your awakened moments. Do it several times. Takes an instant. That's it. So, thank you very much for listening and participating. And we'll see you next week.